By the end of World War I, a new fear overtook American culture that further justified the usage of the Espionage Act, Sedition Act, and surveillance. That is, the Red Scare. The first Red Scare that lasted between 1919 and 1921 was a mass hysteria over the distinct fear of communism, communists, and anarchists sabotaging the United States to spread their beliefs and change the country. The hysteria was spawned from the recent Bolshevik Revolution and the animosity between the United States and Germany during World War I. The government giving into this fear further spread its reaches and the rights of Americans under the same justification the Espionage Act and Sedition Act worked within, that is, for the safety of the country. Many citizens were arrested or fined for their communist and socialist political beliefs and economic beliefs that were seen as a threat. Many citizens were even persecuted based on the assumption that they shared these beliefs with little to no proof. One of the most famous examples of this would be the indictment of the Irish immigrants Sacco and Vanzetti in the mid-1920s. The two were believed to have been involved in a murder of a guard during a robbery, even though there was a lack of evidence for their actual involvement. Due to the fact that they were recently immigrated and had anarchist and socialist beliefs, they faced heavy bias in the court, which led to their guilty verdict. Both of them were given the death sentence and were executed in 1927. Furthermore, another example of those persecuted for their beliefs would be Victor Berger, an immigrated Austrian senator who pushed for anti-interventionist opinions after the war ended. Under the Espionage Act and Judge Landis's bias towards Berger's German background, he was convicted and sent to 20 years in prison. He pleaded his case to the Supreme Court about the unfairness of bias, where it was ruled 7-2 that Berger would still be convicted. However, Judge Landis would not be allowed to rule over the case any longer due to this, despite the fact that the persecution seemed to continue. The government went further after the domestic terrorist attack blew up the Attorney General Alexander Palmer's house. In response, Palmer started a campaign of home invasions from 1919 to 1921 to hunt down suspected sabotaging communists, a time period known as the Palmer Raids. Moreover, they also stepped upon the rights of immigration with the instantiation of the Immigration Act of 1924. The act created quotas on the amount of immigrants allowed from certain nationalities. It was passed, once again, under the guise of protection from and fear of communism spreading in the United States from the immigrants.
Not only were the rights of U.S. citizens altered during World War I, but so were their responsibilities. U.S. entrance into the war meant that citizens were expected to carry out new responsibilities. One example of a responsibility that citizens gained during the war would be the responsibility of fulfilling the military draft. After the United States entered the war in 1917, Congress passed the Selective Service Act, allowing men from age range 21 to 45 to be drafted into military service. Around 2.8 million men were drafted during the war, even with many opposing the draft under the belief that the United States should not enter conflict with other countries. Despite opposition, fulfilling the draft became a major responsibility for millions of men in the United States during the war. Ultimately, the draft allowed the U.S. to build up its military and contribute to the Allied victory in World War I. Another example of a responsibility of American citizens during World War I was rationing. Saving food was necessary during the war, as food supplies had to be sent to the front lines in Europe to provide for the millions of soldiers who required it. To save food, it became the responsibility of the American people to ration, limiting their consumption of products such as sugar and wheat. Rationing was heavily encouraged by the government, and it was a major way that the American people contributed to the war effort. Furthermore, citizens began growing their own food in victory gardens to supplement their rations and further reduce pressure on the food supply, allowing for enough food to be sent to soldiers on the front lines. Maintaining a stable food supply became necessary for the Allied powers during World War I, and as a result, the American people were given the responsibility of saving food through rationing. Liberty bonds were essentially loans from the citizens of America to the government to use for the war, originally proposed in 1913 by Secretary of Treasury William McAdoo. McAdoo believed that we must be willing to go something of personal convenience, something of personal comfort, something of our treasure, all necessary and our lives in the bargain to support our noble sons who got to die for us. McAdoo pushed his idea forward through propaganda and advertising the purchase of Liberty bonds as an act of patriotism. Eventually, it became expected of the citizens of America to pay for Liberty bonds to support the U.S. during the war, creating another responsibility for the American people. Women became the backbone of the United States workforce to support the home front, making up for the losses of the men in the country. During the time of the First World War, most women were barred from voting or serving in military combat roles. Many saw the war as an opportunity to not only serve their countries, but to gain more rights and independence. With millions of men away from home, women filled manufacturing and agricultural positions on the home front. Others provided support on the front lines as nurses, doctors, ambulance drivers, translators, and, in rare cases, on the battlefield with medical care and multilingual communication.